City, Boomer Von Cannon, WBT.
Huh? It's 5:04 and welcome into a Thursday edition of the Carolina Journal News Hour. News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. I'm Nick Craig. Good morning to you, and hopefully you enjoyed your Christmas day yesterday. We're going to roll back the clocks a couple of days this morning to some technical issues that impacted American Airlines flights all across the nation. That, of course, created big-time issues at the Charlotte Douglas Airport on Christmas Eve. There was a company-wide disruption that happened back on Tuesday. It started around 7 a.m., which, as we talked about in the lead-up to the Christmas vacation, that the next couple of days would, of course, be some of the year's busiest travel days, and it was an issue that went on for about an hour. It was a nationwide ground stoppage due to some technical issues that American Airlines was dealing with. After about an hour, American Airlines said, quote, a vendor technology issue briefly affected flights this morning. That, of course, would have been Tuesday. That issue has been resolved and all flights have resumed. We sincerely apologize to our customers for the inconvenience this morning. It's all hands on deck as our team is working diligently to get customers where they need to go as quickly as possible. That, again, it was a nationwide stoppage. American has a major hub over at Charlotte Douglas. Fortunately, it doesn't appear that it caused any major travel plans for individuals, and it was at least early enough in the morning to get things back on track. Busy holiday travel does continue over the next couple of days, and as we get into the New Year's, we'll take a look at some of those holiday travels coming up tomorrow morning for you right here on News Talk 1110 and 99.3 WBT, where it's now 5:06, and we are continuing to track details this morning surrounding the North Carolina race for Supreme Court. Yes, we've got new news to pass along to you this morning. Republican State Supreme Court candidate Jefferson Griffin filed a motion on Monday seeking a preliminary injunction against the North Carolina State Board of Elections. Judge Griffin wants to stop the election board from certifying results of the November the 5th Supreme Court election. He is also seeking an expedited schedule that could lead to a decision on the injunction during the first full week of January. Griffin here is hoping to block the election board from declaring appointed incumbent Democrat Allison Riggs as the election winner. Riggs currently leads Griffin by 734 votes out of more than 5.5 million ballots that were cast statewide. A lawsuit from Griffin aims to block the election board from counting more than 60,000 ballots that he and his legal team have targeted as, quote, unlawful. The State Board of Elections has rejected most of Griffin's protests against those ballots. A final decision on those protests is expected on Friday, according to paperwork from Griffin's lawyers that they filed back on Monday of this week. Unless Griffin secures some sort of injunction by January the 9th, the election board could vote the following day to certify the election, and such a vote would moot Griffin's legal challenge. Griffin and the election board have agreed to a schedule that would have the elections board respond to Griffin's request for an injunction by January the 1st. Griffin would file a reply on January the 3rd, and the U.S. District Judge and Richard Myers, who is overseeing this case at the federal level in the U.S. 4th District, could hold a hearing sometime January 7th or 8th. That, again, is a very tight timetable ahead of the election board potentially certifying these ballots sometime around January the 10th. The court filings indicate that Riggs' lawyers also consent to the schedule that I just went over there, again, January 1st, 3rd, and then 7th or 8th. Reading now from the updated legal challenge that we saw earlier this week. Griffin's lawyers wrote, quote, without a preliminary injunction, mootness will deprive the court of jurisdiction to consider any of the issues presented in this matter. A preliminary injunction, however, will simply stay the board's hand. The board will not be harmed by that injunction. Indeed, North Carolina law contemplates delays in election certifications while judicial review is pending. By contrast, Judge Griffin will be irreparably harmed by the absence of this injunction. His protests will be mooted and he will lose the election, the court filing said, and preventing the board certification from mooting Judge Griffin's challenge to unlawful ballots will serve the important public interest in election integrity and the franchisement, among others. Myers issued an order last Friday denying Griffin's request for a temporary restraining order in the case. He said at the time a motion for a temporary restraining order may only issue if the movement makes a clear showing of immediate injury. That's according to Myers. He says the court finds that the plaintiff, that would be Judge Griffin, has failed to make a clear showing that he will suffer immediate injury before the defendant can be heard in opposition. Griffin filed a complaint last week urging the state Supreme Court to block the election board from counting these unlawful ballots, according to Griffin, in the race. The election board responded the following morning by removing the case to Myers' federal courtroom. Myers also is currently overseeing a lawsuit that the North Carolina Democrat Party filed back on December the 6th, dealing with the same ballot challenges that Griffin addressed in his complaint. Griffin intervened as the defendant in that case. Griffin's complaint highlighted three categories of election protest: voters who registered without providing a driver's license number or the last four digits of a social security number, voters who never lived in the state of North Carolina, and voters and North Carolina voters who are overseas that did not provide valid photo identification. Reading now from the court filing, it says, in response to these protests, the state board and the opposing candidate, Justice Allison Riggs, have claimed that Judge Griffin is seeking a retroactive change in our election law. That flatly mischaracterizes the timeline, according to Griffin's attorneys. Our registration statuses require driver's licenses and or social security numbers back to 2004, and our state constitution has imposed a residency requirement since 1776, and photo identification has been required for absentee voting since at least 2018. That law should have governed this election, that should have governed this election, were therefore established long before this election. The state board simply chose to break the law, end quote. Riggs has also filed a motion to intervene in this case. Two groups and three individual voters working with Democratic operative Mark Elias's law firm have also filed a motion to join this case as defendants. We'll have some additional details on that coming up a little bit later on for you this morning. So as we kind of do the broad strokes of that story this morning, Judge Griffin, again, is filed a motion on Monday seeking that preliminary injunction against the State Board of Elections. We should see some additional movement on that potentially tomorrow and into parts of next week. Of course, we'll have New Year's Eve and New Year's Day smack dab in the middle of the week, so that could potentially slow or delay a couple of things there. We will continue to keep an eye on that. All the pertinent details, we're tracking it right here on the Carolina Journal News Hour, where it's now 5:12. News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. It's time to get a look on this morning after Christmas on the roadways. Boomer Von Cannon's got the latest in traffic.
Hey, thank you, Nick.
your emergency situation station.
It's 5:19. You're listening to the Carolina Journal News Hour on a Thursday morning. News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. Tracking some additional news this morning, President Joe Biden, we covered this on Monday. It was actually breaking news Monday here on the Carolina Journal News Hour. President Joe Biden has commuted the death sentences of 37 federal inmates, that including Anthony Battle, who was convicted of stabbing his wife to death in her barracks at Camp Lejeune here in North Carolina. Battle, a former U.S. Army soldier, was on death row for killing a federal prison guard during a 1994 escape attempt. He was serving 20 years for the 1986 brutal murder of his wife, Minnie Foreman, who was a U.S. Marine Lance Corporal serving at Camp Lejeune at the time. Court records indicate that Battle sexually assaulted her and then stabbed her multiple times, killing her in a fit of rage. Also, according to court documents, in 1994, Battle was found standing near the body of Corrections Officer D'Antonio Washington and admitted to killing him with a hammer. He told investigators that he felt, quote, bossed around and sought respect in prison. Biden's actions means that in this case, that Battle will be off death row and serve imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Monday's mass clemency aligns with Biden's efforts to restrict the federal death penalty to terrorism and hate-motivated mass murders. When Biden took office, his administration imposed a moratorium on federal executions and expressed concerns that the Trump administration would resume executions upon taking office in January. Anti-death penalty advocates praise the move, while critics argues it undermines justice for all victims and faith in America's judicial system. Meantime, outgoing Governor Roy Cooper is being urged by various activist groups to commute all 136 death sentences in North Carolina as he prepares to leave office on January the 1st, coming up here next week. The North Carolina Justice Center continues to hold a vigil in downtown Raleigh. They started that back on December the 10th and are continuing to host it through the December the 31st to pressure Cooper to exercise the governor's communication authority. Carrying out death penalty in North Carolina has been paused for nearly 20 years amid lawsuits stemming from the Racial Justice Act. That is one of our top stories this morning. You can read those details over on our website, carolinajournal.com, where it's now 5:22. News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. In political discussion after discussion, we talk about Republican versus Democrat, but our largest voting bloc in North Carolina is neither of those two parties. It's actually unaffiliated voters. Joining us on the Carolina Journal News Hour this morning, Professor Chris Cooper from Western Carolina University. Professor Cooper, you have got a book out that describes and digs into this group. You talked and called them purple voters. Tell us a little bit about the book and a little bit about this group themselves.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. So the book is Anatomy of a Purple State. And so the idea is trying to look at what makes North Carolina purple and a little bit of the architecture of government. But part of it is looking at these voters. And we've seen a dramatic increase, as you noted, in these unaffiliated voters. It's currently the largest group of registered voters in our state. They passed Republican in 2017, passed Democrat just this last year. And this is a category we created in 1977 in the state of North Carolina. So it's been a slow growth, but a growth nonetheless. That doesn't mean that these are all swing voters. Obviously, most of them are not, right? Most of these folks lean left or lean right. So the way I like to think about it is most unaffiliated voters are not swing voters, but most swing voters are unaffiliated voters. If you want to find that small number of people who are scratching their heads until late about whether to vote and who to vote for, this is the group you're probably going to find them in.
One of the things that makes North Carolina rather interesting is we've got, it depends on who you talk to, either semi-closed or semi-open primaries. So these unaffiliated voters can essentially play ball in both courts. I assume that causes some of the large balloon of that population. They don't have to pick one or the other. They can play in both.
Yeah, that is exactly right. So we created this category in 1977, and for a spell, nobody chose it, or a rounding error from nobody. And the reason was we had closed primaries, right? So if you chose unaffiliated, you're essentially disenfranchising yourself from a primary. Who would want to do that? Answer, not many folks. Then the Republican Party, at a point where the Democrats were outperforming them in big numbers, said, maybe we should open up our primary to these unaffiliated voters. The Democrats, who at that point were doing very well in terms of registration, said, y'all can do whatever you want. We're going to keep our primary closed. So we had this 8-year period of what I like to think of, it's a little wonky, but the asymmetric semi-closed primary system. What I mean by that is the Republicans said, we'll have you. The Democrats said, we won't. And so you started to see the numbers tick up a bit at that point. And then finally, 8 years later, the Democrats got religion and said, maybe we should let these folks in our primary too. They did it, and then it was off to the races, and the sort of steepness of that slope of increase just took off to the moon.
Now, there's been some criticism as of late by both parties that we need to go back to this closed primary system. If something like that were to happen, safe to assume that we'd see a mass evacuation from the unaffiliated voter base here in the state?
I think that's exactly what we'd see. I think we'd see a couple things. First, we'd see a massive cratering in primary turnout. And then I think we would see the pattern shift that every day right now, whatever day you're watching this, whatever day you're listening to this, more people registered today as unaffiliated than either one of the two major parties. Clearly, if we had a closed primary system, I think that would slow down dramatically. You can even hear this on election day, right? Go to your polls on election day, listen to folks that are poll workers talk about when they do same day registration. Oftentimes, poll workers will say, if you choose unaffiliated, you get to vote in either primary you want. Well, not surprisingly, voters tend to take that option, take that flexibility. We do have it in our control as a state to clamp that down if the parties decided they wanted to.
With that, with this group, it's so interesting. You've mentioned in the past that these are not necessarily, all of them are not swing voters. So if I'm a staunch liberal or a staunch conservative, why am I registering as an unaffiliated voter instead of choosing the party that most is close to the things I believe, whether that be Republican or Democrat?
Yeah, I think a couple of things. One is you may be being strategic and say, hey, I want to keep my options open in the primary. And I think maybe the more likely option for most folks is that even if you're a really good conservative or you're a really good liberal, you probably don't want to say out loud that you like political parties, right? That's a really unpopular thing to say. And so, especially in a world where, and I say this actually not making a joke, like if you are online dating, a good way to, keep half the dating pool out is to show up with, a Harris Walls hat or a Trump hat on your dating profile, right? We are just so polarized, and people don't want to keep themselves out of jobs, out of dates, out of social circles, that given the option, I think they're going to take none of the above unless there is some strategic reason to choose a party. And I think both parties, the Democrats and the Republicans, have got to do a better job making the case for why it matters, for why people need to register with their party. Because we've got this little bit of erosion going on, I think, in North Carolina politics that people don't pay attention to. There's fewer and fewer people to be precinct captains for parties. There's fewer and fewer people to contact voters. There's fewer and fewer people to run for office because of the slow deterioration of the party system.
With these voters, do they tend to be what are known as high propensity or low propensity voters, meaning they're likely to actually get out and vote in primaries, things of that nature?
They're much lower propensity voters than members of the two major parties. And part of this is just a function of who they are. These tend to be people from out of state. So unaffiliated is the largest group of voters born out of state, smallest group in state. It is the largest group of people under 45 and the smallest group of people over 45. And so if you say, even putting party aside for a second, who are the ones who are least likely to vote? Newcomers to the state and young people. So the unaffiliated group that's growing is also the group that is the least likely to show up in the first place.
Professor Cooper, tell us the name of the book and where folks can get it.
Yeah, so it's called Anatomy of a Purple State, a North Carolina Politics Primer. You can get it from UNC Press websites. You can get it on Amazon.com. You can get it really most bookstores in the state of North Carolina and even some elsewhere.
Professor Chris Cooper joins us this morning on the Carolina Journal News Hour. Where it's now 5:28, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. It's time to get another look at traffic on this Thursday morning with Boomer Von Cannon.
Hey, thanks a lot, Nick. And
Huh? It's now 5:35. You're listening to the Carolina Journal News Hour. News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. We are still streaming live this morning on our Carolina Journal YouTube channel. You can also take the show with you on demand by downloading our podcast. It's available wherever you get your shows. Just search for the Carolina Journal News Hour. Tap that follow and subscribe button, and you'll get a new show delivered to your smartphone or tablet each and every weekday. It's the Carolina Journal News Hour podcast. Download and subscribe now. Continuing to track details out of this North Carolina Supreme Court race that we've been covering for almost 2 months now. Clients working with Democrat operative Mark Elias's law firm hope to intervene in that federal lawsuit that is tied to the race. The North Carolina Alliance for Retired Americans and Vote Vets Action Fund, alongside 3 individual voters, filed a motion on Saturday, just a couple of days ago, to intervene as defendants in Republican candidate Jefferson Griffin's lawsuit against the State Board of Elections. Lawyers with the Elias Law Group are helping represent the retirees and veterans group, as well as those 3 individuals. Griffin wants a judge to block the election board from counting what he calls unlawful votes in the Supreme Court contest. Griffin's Democrat opponent, appointed incumbent Justice Allison Riggs, has filed paperwork to intervene in the case as well. And according to the filing that was tied to the Elias Law Group, it says, before voting began in the 2024 election, the rules of the road for casting and counting ballots were set and clear. Only after voting had ended, votes had been counted, and it became evident that Judge Jefferson Griffin lost the race for the North Carolina Associate Supreme Court Justice seat. Did Judge Griffin choose to file mass challenges for tens of thousands of voters across the state, demanding retroactive changes to election rules and disenfranchisement of tens of thousands of voters based on these new rules? In other words, after playing the game and losing, Judge Griffin wants to rewrite the rulebook. It continues by saying Judge Griffin's gambit is now before this court. He claims that North Carolinians who had been registered and voted for years were in fact ineligible to vote all along, and that overseas voters who lawfully obtained North Carolina residency through their parents or guardians are no longer permitted to vote in the state, and that military and overseas voters that submitted their ballots as instructed nevertheless should have their votes thrown out after the fact. In short, Judge Griffin seeks disenfranchisement of voters who followed the law as it existed before the election and did nothing wrong. Worse still, his requested relief would violate several federal statutes and the United States Constitution. So you've got a lot of parties that are all involved in this lawfare surrounding Judge Griffin's Supreme Court race. We'll have some additional details on what is going on in his case and the latest details coming up for you here in just a little bit. It's now 5:39. You're listening to the Carolina Journal News Hour. There's a town called Carrboro, Chapel Hill, and they are making some news this morning as they are suing Duke Energy. They are the largest electrical producer and provider here in the state of North Carolina. To get some more details on that, it's my pleasure to welcome back to the Carolina Journal News Hour this morning the editor-in-chief of CarolinaJournal.com, Donna King. Donna, this town, it's not small. It's about 22,000 people, but they're going after the behemoth in Duke Energy. What are the details on that you're tracking this morning?
Yeah, of course. Good morning. This is coming from the Town Council of Carrboro, North Carolina. It's in Orange County, just outside of Chapel Hill. This town council has filed a lawsuit against Duke Energy for what they describe as they want damages for climate-related harm, saying they're alleging that the utility misled the public about the dangers of fossil fuel emissions and how fast they would switch to renewables and that kind of thing. There's a couple of things about this. One, there have been other lawsuits like this from climate activist groups in other states. This is the first time that an actual municipality, as opposed to a group of activists, have filed a lawsuit. And it's also against a big utility. So there's a couple of different layers to this, which make it pretty interesting. One being a municipality. This is funded by a group called NC Warn. Now, NC Warn is a nonprofit group that is working on goals that include things like the the transition to clean power, and to try to really pump up the press coverage of the what they say the crisis of climate change. So this lawsuit is one of them. And what that's meant, though, that critics are saying this is just all political theater to make a point, and they're using the court system to do it.
Well, I guess it would be a valid question to ask if you're suing somebody and claiming damages. Do they have any specific examples of what specifically Duke Energy has done to hurt this town of about 22,000 people right outside Chapel Hill?
Well, one of the things they're pointing to, which I think is interesting, is they're pointing to Hurricane Helene as being evidence of the damage of climate change, and that Duke Energy is participating in a misinformation campaign about the risk of climate change. So, we've had our own policy analyst and environmental expert here at the John Locke Foundation talk about that. And really, even the Obama administration, folks that have worked there have said that attempt to link hurricanes to climate change is not really grounded in science. And even one of them called it, dishonest. So, some of the basics of what this lawsuit is predicated on are being debated within the scientific community. But I also think that it is getting what they wanted. It's getting that publicity to their issues. But groups like the Consumer Choice Center, they're saying that what this really does is it undermines the progress that North Carolina, the very real progress that North Carolina has made toward reducing emissions.
Well, let me ask you just that. Duke has been in the news for the last couple of decades, it seems, at this point, Donna, as they've converted a vast majority of their coal plants to steam plants. They are on carbon reduction goals, depending on what program you look at, 2030, 2050, as they kind of come alongside a lot of the things that the Cooper administration wanted to do in regards to reducing emissions and things like that. It seems rather interesting that they've been leading this clean energy transition, if you'll call it that, and now they're being sued, I guess, for not doing it quick enough.
That's what they're saying. They're saying that they weren't moving down the timeline that they wanted, and but it is important. You're right. This whole transition to clean energy has been a big focus of the Cooper administration, and really, if you look at just back to 2020 to 2005, just over the last 20 years, North Carolina has reduced its carbon output by 52%. This is the emissions from electricity have declined 52% over the last 20 years. And you really have to look at that. The Energy Institute also says if you compare that to, say, like China, they're increasing all the time. The rest of the world is increasing. So this focus on North Carolina specifically in this lawsuit may have difficulty getting traction.
That was going to be my next question for you. Yeah. What exactly does something like this look like, Dono? How do we go forward? Again, you're talking about a relatively small township going after a major electrical producer and provider that's not just in North Carolina. They're up from Ohio all the way down to the Florida coast. What does the next step for something like this look like? Is this a state, a federal issue? Where does this go?
Well, they filed it in Orange County, in Superior Court of Orange County, so that's where it would be heard there. But the head of NC Warren, who's funding and who's doing this lawsuit and supporting this lawsuit, says that this is sort of like what the tobacco companies did. That's the connection that they're trying to draw. The Duke Energy is like the tobacco companies in that they're misleading the public about the risks of climate change. I think that they're going to have a hard time doing that, but we'll see, because there have been these lawsuits in other places. In Honolulu, in a lawsuit that's only similar, it's a little bit different in that it's not filed by a municipality, the state of Honolulu settled that lawsuit. So I would be surprised if Duke Energy took that tactic, but I do think that this should be interesting to watch, because it's a trend of starting to look at lawfare as a way to make your political point.
Do you think if something like this escalated to more of the federal level, and we saw maybe more states, more municipalities, even maybe counties and cities, much smaller geographical areas, going after these major electrical and utility providers across the country, that we'd maybe see some conversation or some comments coming in from the federal government in regards to this? That we're expecting a big shakeup here come early parts of next month.
Sure. Oh, there's going to be big changes. But if you look at, there was a lawsuit similar to this filed in San Francisco. And one thing that came out of that is that the Ninth Circuit Court actually said that the lawsuit needed to be dismissed, and a group there asked the U.S. Supreme Court to take up the case instead, even though the Ninth Circuit, which, they're not by any stretch of the imagination going to be right-leaning, they said that this lawsuit needed to be dismissed there. So the plaintiffs in that suit asked the U.S. Supreme Court to take it up, and they have not responded. So I would anticipate that this is really going to generate press and discussion and truthfully spend a lot of left-leaning money when now that the election is over, they've got a place to put it.
Very interesting information this morning. You can read more details on our story by visiting carolinajournal.com. Well, it's now 546, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. It's time to get another look at traffic this morning with Boomer Von Cannon.
Hey, Nick, we're looking great along.
Good morning again. It's 5:51. You're listening to the Carolina Journal News Hour on News Talk 1110 99.3 WBT. I'm Nick Craig. Good morning to you. Well, we are continuing to track, of course, this high-stakes Supreme Court race across the state of North Carolina. Republican state Supreme Court candidate Jefferson Griffin filed a motion a couple of days before Christmas on Monday seeking a preliminary injunction against the North Carolina State Board of Elections. Griffin wants to stop the election board from certifying results of the November the 5th election. He also is seeking an expedited schedule that could lead to a decision on the injunction by the courts during the first full week of January. Griffin hopes to block the election board from declaring Allison Riggs the winner, where she currently leads by 734 votes. I'll note that there was over 5.5 million ballots cast statewide. A lawsuit from Griffin aims to block the election board from counting more than 60,000 ballots that are being labeled as unlawful, according to the Griffin team. The board has rejected most of Griffin's protests against those ballots as of right now. A final decision on those protests is expected potentially as early as tomorrow, according to paperwork that Griffin's lawyers filed on Monday. Unless Griffin secures an injunction by January 9th, the election board could vote the following day to certify the election. Such a vote would moot Griffin's legal challenges at that point once the election is in fact certified. The court filings indicate that Riggs's lawyers understand the schedule, and here it is. Griffin and the election board have agreed to this schedule that would have the election board respond to Griffin's request for an injunction by January the 1st. That's coming up next Wednesday. Griffin would file a reply by January the 3rd, and U.S. Chief District Judge Richard Myers could hold a hearing sometime on either January the 7th or January the 8th. Again, Riggs's lawyers seemingly are on track with that timetable. According to Griffin's lawyers, they said without a preliminary injunction, mootness will deprive the court of jurisdiction to consider any of the issues presented in this matter. A preliminary injunction, however, would simply stay the board's hand. The board would not be harmed by that injunction. Indeed, North Carolina law contemplates delays in election certification while judicial review is pending. By contrast, Judge Griffin would be irreparably harmed absent the injunction. His protests would be mooted and he would lose the election. And preventing the board certification from mooting Judge Griffin's challenge to these unlawful ballots will serve the important public interests in election integrity and enfranchisement, among others. Myers issued an order last Friday denying Griffin's request for a temporary restraining order against the Board of Elections in this case. The judge wrote at the time, "A motion for a temporary restraining order may only issue if the movant makes a clear showing of immediate injury. The court finds that the plaintiffs have failed to make a clear showing that he will suffer immediate injury before the defendant can be heard in opposition." Griffin filed a complaint last week urging the state's highest court to block the state election board from counting unlawful ballots in the race. The election board responded the following morning, removing the case to Myers' federal courtroom. Myers is currently overseeing a lawsuit that the North Carolina Democrat Party filed that was back on December the 6th, dealing with the same ballot challenges that Griffin addresses in his newest complaint. Griffin intervened as a defendant in that case as well. Griffin's complaint highlighted three categories of election protests: voters who registered without providing a driver's license number or the last four digits of a social security number in violation of federal law, voters who have never lived in North Carolina, and overseas voters who did not provide photo identification. In response to this, the court reads, the state board and opposing candidate Justice Allison Riggs have claimed that Judge Griffin is seeking a retroactive change in election law. That flatly mischaracterizes the timeline. Our registration statuses require driver's licenses or social security numbers back to 2004. Our state constitution has imposed a residency requirement since 1776, and photo identification has been required for absentee voting since at least 2018. The laws that should have been govern this election were therefore established long before this election. The state board simply chose to break the law. Riggs has filed a motion to intervene in this case. 2 groups and 3 individual voters working with the Democrat operative Mark Elias's law firm have also filed a motion to join that case as defendants. We talked about that a little bit earlier on this morning. And so what is the TLDR, the too long didn't read? Well, that is that this case and these various cases continue to be in the court system, and it looks like, regardless of what the timeline looks like, we should have a final decision on this, whether the State Board of Elections certifies the election results, whether the federal court tells them to hold off. We should know all of that within the next week and a half or so. Obviously, a compressed timeline with the New Year's Eve holiday coming up middle parts of next week. Nevertheless, we're continuing to track all of those details here on the Carolina Journal News Hour and, of course, over on our website, carolinajournal.com. That's going to do it for a Thursday edition of the Carolina Journal News Hour. WBT News is next, followed by Good Morning BT. We're back tomorrow morning, 5 to 6 a.m. right here on News Talk 1110 and 99.3 WBT.